The woman known to history as Wallis Simpson was born Bessa Wallis Warfield in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, around the 19th of June 1896. However, the exact date of her birth is somewhat unclear, as there is no birth certificate for Simpson, and there are no contemporary records of her birth in newspapers. Her father was Teakle Wallis Warfield, and her mother was Alice Montague. The name they gave their daughter was an amalgamation of the name of her Aunt Bessie and her grandfather's friend, Severn Teakle Wallis. This was soon abandoned, however, as, in her words, it was only fit for a cow. She preferred Wallis for its androgynous character and its distinctiveness. Blue Ridge, the site of her birth, was a crossroads between counties in both Pennsylvania and Maryland, and straddles the Mason-Dixon line. This fact permitted her an identity which spanned both the northern and southern United States, a fact which she often made use of during her later social life. Simpson's parents, cagey and vague as she herself recalled, likely married as a result of an unplanned pregnancy and had a quiet ceremony in 1895, just 7 months before she was born. Her family originated from the Maryland upper middle class, with Southern sympathies which had manifested themselves during the American Civil War, after which the family had gained considerable wealth in the Baltimore banking scene. However, her father, Teakle, had developed tuberculosis and had been unable to gain such wealth, working as a lowly clerk in the Continental Trust, his uncle's bank. He died 5 months after the birth of his daughter, appearing in only a single photograph with her, sitting in a wheelchair. Baltimore, where Wallis grew up, was one of the fastest-growing cities in the United States at the time, and was increasingly attractive to the upper middle classes, who erected large homes around the area of Mount Vernon. Baltimore's location on the coast allowed it to make a speedy recovery from the Civil War, and it was home to a significant immigrant community, which formed 1/3 of its overall population. After the death of her father, Wallis and her mother moved in with Anna Warfield, her grandmother on her father's side, in a large brownstone house near the Monument in Baltimore. Anna took her granddaughter shopping every Saturday, which she described later with fondness, recalling that it was as exciting as a trip to the moon. Wallis, her mother and grandmother, also shared the house with another member of the family, Uncle Sol, Solomon Warfield, a financier and politician with ambitions for public office in the city, who financed her and her mother, but was a cruel and controlling influence, and Wallis and her mother soon moved back to the Brexton Hotel, where they had lived at the time of her birth. The two experienced emotional and financial turmoil at this time, and would spend solitary days, her mother selling embroidery at the local women's exchange shop. However, they were soon after invited to live with Aunt Bessie Merriman, her mother's sister, who had also just been widowed. Whilst living with her Aunt Bessie, Wallis attended school, first at Miss O'Donnell's school and then at the Arundel School on St. Paul Street, which provided her with a fairly basic but still important routine and which allowed her to learn how to read and write. This early education was funded by Uncle Sol, to whom she had to deliver her school reports. Wallis then attended Oldfields, the most expensive school in the city, where she fell in love with basketball and played under the supervision of Charlotte Noland, a young teacher whom Wallis later described as a mixture of gay, deft teasing and a drill sergeant's sternness, a dashing figure in every setting. The school fostered an old-fashioned approach to academic and social education and employed an honour system whereby students were required to confess to their own wrongdoing. Wallis reportedly misbehaved by smoking and by jumping from a balcony in order to meet a boy and was regarded by her classmates as somewhat of a ringleader, remembered for her independence and confidence. During her time at Oldfields, Wallis's mother had remarried to John Racine, the son of the Democratic Party leader in Baltimore, who had the capacity to deliver financial stability to Wallis and her mother, but who never displaced Tickle from the hearts of either woman. It was at this time that Wallis met a woman who was to become one of her greatest friends, Mary Kirk, a fellow student at Oldfields. Both girls were described as boy-crazy and far more interested in clothes than in school by Mary's older sister, Bucky. She also noted the propensity both had for attracting male attention and remarked that the two would be immediately surrounded by boys at any party they attended. In spring 1914, Wallis graduated from Oldfield School, signing her name in the yearbook with the message, "All is love," after which she and Mary became debutantes, albeit with restricted grandeur owing to the looming war in Europe, in respect to which excess was seen as bad form. Culture at the time dictated that before she could be released out as a debutante, Wallis would have to host her own party, which, after the death of her stepfather John Racine in 1913, would have to be funded by Uncle Sol. He refused, citing the war in Europe as an excuse, and she was left to accept invitations to other debutante events thrown by her friends and, in some capacity, rivals. It was at this time that Wallis's grandmother died and the family entered a period of prolonged mourning. Wallis escaped this social inertia by moving to stay with her cousin Corinne Mustin in Florida, who lived close to the site of a U.S. naval aviation facility, which afforded Wallis access to the dashing young officers who flew there. Wallis arrived in Pensacola, Florida in April 1916, aged 19, and within a day had written to her mother announcing that she had met the world's most fascinating aviator. Lieutenant Earl Winfield Spencer, Jr., 8 years older than Wallis, was the object of her attention. He was an experienced pilot with 6 years' experience in the Navy. Wynne was well regarded in the Navy and was the 20th pilot in the U.S. Navy to win his wings. Within weeks of their meeting, Wynne asked Wallis to marry him, to which she instantly agreed, but on the condition that she got the approval of her family first. 5 months later, the two were formally engaged and had their engagement party hosted at the Baltimore Country Club. On the 8th of November 1916, the two were married against a turbulent political background of constant talk of entering the war in Europe. This had dominated the U.S. presidential election, which had concluded just before, with most Americans sustaining the belief that whilst they should support the British and the French, they should keep their troops out of the conflict. The honeymoon for the newlyweds was split between West Virginia and New York, where Wallis had a first encounter with her new husband's alcoholism. On one occasion, Wynne flew into a rage when he was unable to obtain drink in the dry state of West Virginia. Shortly after this incident, the couple returned to Florida, where Wynne was an instructor at the Navy Flight School, and Wallis embarked on the ritual existence of the housewife, entertaining other Navy wives at her home and learning how to paint. In April 1917, the U.S. joined the war, and the couple moved to Boston, where Wynne was the commander of the Naval Aviation School at Squantum. He had been effectively grounded and saw the move as a form of demotion, causing him great anger and frustration, a response which manifested in a greater reliance on alcohol. For the next 8 years, Wallis endured a troubled marriage with Wynne, whom she had known hardly at all before their marriage, and who was increasingly cruel and manipulative towards her. During his working hours, Wallis would wander the streets of Boston and attend court cases as a way of passing the time, and after a time, the couple moved again, when Wynne was asked to establish a new flying school in San Diego. Wynne's anger mounted during the latter stages of the war and worsened when his brother, Dumaresque, was killed in action whilst flying in France. His younger brother was awarded the Croix de Guerre, aged 17, in the same theatre. His own comparative inaction was a source of immense jealousy and frustration, and Mary Kirk grew concerned that her friend was being abused by her husband. According to Wallis's later memoirs, Wynne became ever more abusive as he was passed over for promotion and prevented from entering any sort of combat zone. He would make her watch as he burned her family photographs and locked her in her room for hours on end. In 1920, the two decided that they should live apart for a time, although they moved back in together when Wynne was posted to Washington at the Bureau of Aeronautics. During this time, Wynne's abuse was sustained, and after one incident when he locked Wallis in the bathroom for a number of hours, she decided that she would divorce him, despite the immense social taboo that this constituted. She received no support from her family. Her mother and aunt both said that the plan was shameful and that she would stain the family name by being the first to undergo such a split. Wynne was soon posted to the Far East as a gunboat captain, and Wallis remained in the US, living with her mother from June 1921 and surviving on the $225 she received monthly from Wynne. In autumn 1922, Wallis moved into a Georgetown house with a friend, the wife of another naval aviator who was also posted to the Far East. Her friend was the daughter of an admiral. This gave Wallis a social status which afforded her the opportunity to make friends in high places, many of whom were unattached men, a scene which she described as a special paradise for a woman on her own. This environment honed her skills as a socialite, and Wallis made sure to be up to date with current affairs so that she could engage with these topics in the social circle she had entered, and when she was offered a trip to Paris with her cousin, she jumped at the chance and set sail in 1924. During her time in France, Wallis learned that her Uncle Sol was unwilling to pay for her divorce, and when she received a letter from Wynne asking her to join him in the Far East, she agreed and arrived in Hong Kong a short time later in September 1924. On meeting Wynne, it seemed at first that the situation between them had been repaired. He informed her that he had stopped drinking and certainly appeared healthier and more self-controlled than when the two had last met. However, this was not to last, and within a couple of weeks Wynne had returned to drinking and abuse, caused in part by his suspicion of Wallis and his belief that she was flirting with other men whilst he was on duty. A short time later, Wallis informed Wynne that this second attempt at marriage was over, and that she would be leaving him for good, a conclusion to which he offered no resistance. She then travelled, alone, to Shanghai, which was in a state of tension after the founding of the Communist Party there in 1921. The city had been under the control of the British since 1842, and the conclusion of the Opium War, a lease which had led to great tension between the British occupiers and the Chinese inhabitants. After a spell in Shanghai, Wallis travelled to Peking on a journey that was interrupted several times by armed brigands and against the advice of the US consulate. She stayed with a family she had met in San Diego and wrote home ecstatically about her experiences in the city, which she found exotic and exciting. During her time in Peking, Wallis became acquainted with diplomats, military officers, and other influential persons, including the husband of Benito Mussolini's daughter, Galeazzo Ciano. She did not encounter any potential husbands, however, and returned to the United States after her Lotus year in China, arriving in Seattle in September 1925. After she returned to the US, Wallis visited her mother and then went to stay in Virginia, where she hoped to gain a formal divorce. She wrote to Wynne asking that he send a letter confirming that he had deserted her and that they had not been in contact with one another for the previous 3 years. Obviously a mistruth, since they had met in China. However, Wynne was willing to backdate his letter so that it appeared the two had been separated for a greater period of time. Soon afterwards, in the latter months of 1927, her Uncle Sol died, leaving Wallis little more than a single room and a bond in the family bank. This snub occurred because of Sol's disapproval of Wallis's divorce, and he had effectively disinherited her as a result. In December 1927, she formally obtained a divorce from Wynne and was now a free woman. Wallis settled in New York, living with her friend Mary Kirk, who had married a glamorous French Army veteran who had traveled to the US to train American troops. Wallis made some half-hearted attempts to find work, but lacked drive, relying instead on good fortune and the hope of a husband who would bring in a sizable income. Mary was often frustrated at Wallis's lack of proactivity and recalled that she rejected a job as a secretary owing to her disdain for the typewriter. During this period, Mary introduced Wallis to Ernest Simpson and his wife Dorothea. Despite the fact that he was married and a father, Ernest soon formed an attachment to Wallis and began to take her to art galleries and dinners. Wallis was certainly desperate for an income and a steady household, and appreciated the learned and intellectual disposition that Ernest had, as well as his knowledge of classics and art. He lacked the same grandeur as the naval officers she had courted in Florida, however. He had shown considerable bravery in leaving Harvard, aged 21, to join the Coldstream Guards and fight in the First World War before the US had formally entered the conflict. Although he was never actually deployed to the front line, he still wore his guard's tie most days. Simpson had adopted what he considered to be a British attitude towards life and remained financially austere and stiff-upper-lipped. Despite his Jewish heritage, his son later recalled that he would hide this part of his character and was even casually anti-Semitic at the dinner table. Indeed, his son was only made aware of his heritage after Ernest had died. In July 1928, Wallis wrote to her mother that the best and wisest thing for me to do is to marry Ernest. I am very fond of him, and he is kind, which will be a contrast. I can't go on wandering for the rest of my life, and I feel so tired of fighting the world all alone and with no money. Later that month in London, Wallis and Ernest married in a registry office in Chelsea, which both described as a dreary setting for a wedding, proceeding to the Grosvenor Hotel for the reception. Afterwards, Ernest and Wallis travelled to France for their honeymoon. This was an immensely happy period, and Wallis wrote that Ernest was a splendid guide, and that he cared for her and gave her a sense of security that she had not felt since childhood. After their return, Wallis attempted to gain influence in British social circles, initially with limited success. The novelist Barbara Cartland described her as aggressively American and recalled that she told us rather vulgar stories and I was shocked to the core. Wallis also struggled with the new social dynamics and setting of life in London, stating that there was an essential difference in the status between men and women in Britain, which was not the case in her experiences in America. In the US, she and the other wives of naval officers had proactively fought for their husbands' status and promotion, whereas British women, despite their formidable power in their own sphere, were still accepting the status of a second sex. In 1929, Wallis was informed that her mother was gravely ill, and she travelled back over the Atlantic to find her in a coma. She died on the 2nd of November and had nothing in her possession, her savings having been eliminated by the Wall Street crash. Wallis was deeply angered and upset at this injustice and returned to London with the intention of distracting herself by throwing all of her energies into the decoration and maintenance of their new home. This soon afforded her a unique status, and she became known amongst London social circles for her parties, decor, and unusual manner of hosting. She leaned heavily into her Southern heritage and offered up American food, for which she soon became known. Ever since she had arrived in London, Wallis had expressed a desire to meet Edward, the Prince of Wales. Edward was then aged 37, but retained a youthful appearance and a radiant charm which had made him the object of much attention. Edward had attended Osborne Naval College before going up to Magdalen College, Oxford, which he left before graduating, and on the outbreak of the First World War, Edward joined the Grenadier Guards, although he was prevented from entering any dangerous combat zones. He had a difficult relationship with his father, King George V, and remained scared and resentful of him into adulthood, a resentment which grew when his father prevented him from being deployed to the front, even writing to Lord Kitchener, the Secretary of State for War, begging to be allowed to go, although he was yet again let down when Kitchener informed him that the greatest danger was not his death, but his capture. This period seems to have had a marked effect on the prince, and his diaries reveal that he was depressed and battled with a hatred of his own appearance, often refusing food and exercising excessively. He also demonstrated many nervous behaviours and obsessed about his physical appearance in a way which would possibly now be described as anorexic. Edward was often described as erratic and would cause his staff a great deal of stress when on tour. He would arrive late to official functions, and when telegrammed that his father was seriously ill, he laughed and claimed that it was a joke concocted by the then Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, as an electoral dodge. Wallis and Edward had their first encounter in January 1931 as a result of a mutual friend, Thelma Furness, who invited both for a week of fox hunting in Leicestershire. Wallis was highly nervous beforehand and had requested etiquette lessons from another friend before embarking on the event, although once she had arrived, her naturally forward character had made itself known. She criticised the prince for talking to her about seemingly conventional topics and asked that he make a greater effort. Some weeks passed before the two met again, although Wallis was pleased when the prince recognised her at their second meeting in May. Wallis was later introduced to the court alongside Ernest, who dressed for the occasion in his guard's uniform. They once again met the Prince of Wales, who had made a comment under his breath that something had to be done about the lights, as they made all the women look ghastly. When Edward later complimented Wallis on her dress, she retorted, "But sir, I thought you said we all looked ghastly." In early 1932, Wallis entertained the prince at her home for the first time, for which she decided to serve a classic American menu of black bean soup, grilled lobster, fried chicken Maryland, and a raspberry soufflé. The prince stayed until 4 a.m. and asked for several of Wallis's recipes. The evening was evidently a success, and Edward asked Wallis to join him for a weekend at his home. She and Ernest attended and were well received, although following this, Ernest was increasingly concerned at his wife's habits. He was working ever harder in the city, whilst she had a growing desire to throw more and more extravagant parties, which he was struggling to afford. However, from mid-1932, the couple were increasingly invited to the home of the Prince of Wales. This was ostensibly for the purpose of chaperoning her friend, Thelma Furness, who was the girlfriend of Edward at that time. Wallis, as a married woman, was to act as the invigilator of their interactions as a third party. Meanwhile, Wallis and Ernest became increasingly detached from one another, Ernest working longer hours and often required to travel overseas for work. Wallis nurtured her relationship with the prince, which he evidently valued in return, throwing a birthday party for her 37th birthday, to which she responded in kind by purchasing him a monogrammed matchbox and inviting him to an Independence Day party at her home. In January 1934, Thelma Furness sailed for the United States, leaving Edward without her. Wallis and Ernest were increasingly separated, and she spent more time with the prince than ever before, although she was slightly taken aback at the volume of attention he demanded from her, phoning her multiple times in a single day and inviting himself to their flat. Wallis was worried about the state of her marriage and professed many times in letters that she was concerned about losing Ernest, whom she valued and loved as a source of stability and security. When she was invited by the prince to attend Ascot with him, her aunt wrote a strongly worded letter to Wallis decrying the behaviour of Edward and reminding her what this would communicate to Ernest. Edward made it increasingly clear that Wallis had displaced Thelma and, upon her return from America, would avoid her and make pains to be charming to Wallis, even when Thelma and Ernest were both present. The prince cruelly dismissed his former sweetheart and isolated himself from many of his former companions, allowing only Wallis's phone calls to be put through. In November 1934, the prince expressed a desire to present Wallis to his parents at Buckingham Palace. She arrived wearing jewels that he had given her and was introduced to the king and queen. She failed to make a good impression and was banned from attending Silver Jubilee events and the Royal Box at Ascot. Undeterred, Edward invented new ways to spend time with Wallis, inviting her to ski with him in Austria in February 1935. She agreed without asking Ernest, who was instead forced to remain at home and watch the love affair between his wife and the prince emerge on the public stage. Wallis was evidently aware of this and wrote to the prince afterwards explaining that she was concerned about the relationship she had with him and that she thought he spent too long at her flat and thoughtlessly trod on his relationships with Thelma and his other friends. She pleaded with him to make things a little easier for me. He replied to this request with more money and gifts, which sapped her capacity to leave. Scandalized servants reported around this time that Wallis's rooms at his home had been extended to include a wardrobe which connected to his own, allowing unfettered access between them without either person having to emerge. This caused a minor crisis when it was rumoured around the household that Edward was a liar, he had sworn to his father that Wallis was not his mistress, and an adulterer. By October 1935, the letters exchanged between Wallis and the prince were openly romantic, and he made no pretense about his desire to marry her. One letter ran, "I love you more and more every minute, and no difficulties or complications can possibly prevent our ultimate happiness." On the 20th of January 1936, the king died, hastened to his end by the administration of morphine and cocaine injected by the royal physician, Lord Dawson, in order that his death be timed to be printed in the morning papers. Edward was now king, and both Wallis and Ernest wrote separately to him to console him and to offer their services to their new monarch. Subsequent events deeply involved Wallis, who was given a prominent seat when the ascendancy of Edward VIII was announced, and later rode with him in his car. Crowds reportedly bowed as they assumed that she was the Duchess of Kent from a distance, but soon realized that it was Wallis who remained next to the king. Official engagements and social gatherings which involved Edward now also intimately involved Wallis. Her easygoing attitude and position made her even more of a spectacle. Wallis routinely asked guests to dress down for dinner and made it clear that guests who arrived late would incur no sort of social repercussion. Noel Coward remarked in a letter that he was sick to death of having quiet suppers with the king and Mrs. Simpson. Many guests to these gatherings were interested and sometimes indignant at the dynamic in the relationship which had emerged between Edward and Wallis. She often commanded him and reprimanded him in front of guests. One instance saw her tease him on his decision to have his documents read to him rather than reading them himself. Prime Minister Baldwin became increasingly concerned about the attitudes of the new king to matters of state. He often left state papers unread and failed to form his own opinions of current events, preferring to defer to those of others. Wallis also had access to state papers which he would leave around for her to read, and she became in many ways a confidant of his. Eventually, Baldwin decided that only papers which required the signature of the king should be sent to him. Events in Europe had taken a dramatic turn during the year of 1936. Adolf Hitler had invaded the Rhineland in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, and in July, a protracted campaign against the fascist coup of General Franco had erupted in Spain. The king was professionally absent, his sole focus being to marry Wallis. The Davidson Memorandum, produced in 1936 by Lord Davidson and circulated to cabinet officials, described Wallis as a gold digger and posed the solution that if Ernest and she could be convinced to return to America, then they could avoid the risk of her becoming queen. The memorandum closed by stating, "Mrs. S. is very close to Leopold von Hirsch, and has, if she likes to read them, access to all secret and cabinet papers." This latter part of the memorandum shows evident concern that Wallis could pass secrets and sensitive information to Germany, Leopold von Hirsch being the incumbent ambassador. George VI later wrote to the Prime Minister that, "I must tell you quite honestly that I do not trust Wallis's loyalty." Wallis was indeed courted by several senior Italian and German officials and lunched with Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's special envoy. Friends of Wallis's stated that he called upon her every day he had in London and always sent her a large box of flowers whenever he had to leave. During this period, Mary Kirk, a dear school friend of Wallis, had evidently taken pity on Ernest, given his effectively ended marriage, and she soon professed in private that she was in love with him. Wallis was upset at the sight of her husband becoming closer with her friend, but given the circumstances, she could hardly be surprised. It was an open secret that their marriage was over, and he was privately referred to as the Master of the Mistress. Wallis and the king would also host lavish dinners to which only the most exalted guests were invited. On one such occasion in May, the king and Wallis hosted the Prime Minister and his wife, Stanley and Lucy Baldwin, Admiral of the Fleet Sir Ernley Chatfield, as well as the aviator Charles Lindbergh and his wife Anne. In July, Ernest was in Paris and booked a hotel room alongside a female companion who gave the name Buttercup Kennedy. When he returned home, he found a letter from Wallis in which she informed Ernest that she was to sue for divorce. He had evidently been followed by someone in communication with Wallis and, upon reading her letter, moved out of their home and took up residence in the Guards Club. This process having been started, Wallis and the king planned a holiday together. Edward wanted to travel to Spain, but was advised not to on the grounds that the Spanish Civil War was still underway. "I really am annoyed with the Foreign Office for having messed up my holiday in this stupid manner," he wrote to his mother. The pair instead planned to travel down the Dalmatian coast in a yacht, which was to be flanked by 2 Royal Navy destroyers. At home, the matter of divorce remained highly controversial and taboo. Fewer than 5,000 couples a year legally separated, and until 1937, it was only permitted in the event that a wife sought a divorce from her husband if he had committed adultery. If both wife and husband had committed adultery, then the law bizarrely precluded either from obtaining a divorce. The king was expected not only to keep the law, but to exemplify an ideal, a matter which was highly problematic given his love for Wallis. Some letters published after the fact have suggested that Wallis was subject to coercion from Edward during this period, that he had informed her that if she left him, he would commit suicide. Wallis was evidently in a tricky situation and continued to write to Ernest in private that she missed him and lamented their separation. She described her own feelings of immense fear and entrapment in a situation she could no longer control. Indeed, the public and private situation had become ever harder for her to endure, and she was subject to great opposition from the Duchess of York, who openly ignored her at gatherings, and from a press which increasingly antagonized the American harlot. In a letter penned to Ernest, she wrote, "I have had so much trouble and complications with everyone. Also, I am terrified of court, etc., and the US press has done untold harm. I feel small and licked by it all." She concluded the letter with, "Love, Wallis, I am so lonely." Whilst the British press had abstained from printing much material about the couple, with the exception of Cavalcade, the US press had become obsessed with them and included photographs of Edward and Wallis in most daily newspapers. The trial for her divorce was a major focal point of their attention and was a largely embarrassing spectacle in which Ernest confessed that he had enjoyed bed and breakfast with Elizabeth Buttercup Kennedy, who was, in fact, Mary Kirk, her childhood friend. The whole case was concluded in 14 minutes, and Wallis dined that night with the king. During dinner, Edward informed her that he had spoken the week before, on the 20th of October, with Stanley Baldwin, confessing to him that he had a firm intention to marry Wallis. The Prime Minister was firmly opposed to the idea, but realised that duty limited him to advising the monarch alone. The position was well summarised by Violet Bonham Carter, daughter of the former Prime Minister H. Asquith, who wrote that the king faced a dilemma that many human beings have had to face and meet with less at stake. The same line was not taken by many other parts of the British establishment, and it was reported by Lady Hilda Runciman that the British Legion had proclaimed, "We could not stand the shock of the proposed marriage of the King and Wallis Simpson." This view echoed that of the wider church community, which was shocked at the prospect of such a union and embarked on a programme to remind the public of the benefits of a stable, unbroken marriage. Wallis faced increasing opposition from the aristocracy, the political classes and, as she was warned, the press, which she had been assured would not hold its breath about the matter for much longer. The prospect of their union was indeed presented as such a considerable issue that Stanley Bruce, the former Prime Minister of Australia, recalled that Baldwin and he had conversed, stating, "The alarming and devastating possibility that the king should marry the woman, the people of this country and the Dominions would never accept the woman as queen. Quite possibly, the House of Commons would cancel the civil list, and the throne would be imperilled. the empire would be endangered, the government would resign, and it would be quite impossible to get an alternative government. The king soon after informed Baldwin bluntly that, "I mean to abdicate and marry Mrs. Simpson," a proposal which he could simply not understand. Indeed, Wallis was still publicly claiming that she and the king were friends, but they had no intention of marrying one another. She continued to write to Ernest, professing her desire to return and live with him, and strongly suggesting that she felt totally out of control in a social and legal process which had carried her far from her intended destination. The situation for Wallis worsened progressively, and she was soon subject to violence. Rocks were thrown at her windows. She received letters written with poisoned ink, and there was a great concern amongst officials that she could be accosted. Baldwin even remarked that he feared some woman might shoot her, and she was unable to lead anything akin to a normal life, unable to go shopping or attend her favourite salon, amidst the bomb scares that constantly threatened her. In December 1936, it was determined that Wallis could not remain in England, and it was arranged that she should leave the country as soon as possible. An attack on the couple by Dr. A.W.F. Blunt, the Bishop of Bradford, had ignited the fury of the British press, who had soon after collectively decided to break the embargo they had applied to their own reporting. The final evening Wallis spent with Edward in England in 1936 was a painful one. The king was tearful and implored Wallis to call him when once she had left, regardless of the time. She left for France the same day and arrived at a hotel in Rouen at 5:15 a.m. the next morning. The car was pursued for much of the journey, and Wallis was only able to snatch a couple of hours' sleep before she and her driver continued. Conditions at home had changed so rapidly that Edward's plan to remain king after a planned public address had been demolished over a single weekend. He started to plan for his abdication, seeing this as the final remaining course of action which would permit him and Wallis to marry. Edward and Wallis communicated daily during this period, and all correspondence to the palace via telephone had to be suspended for at least 2 hours for their use. The king was in a constant state of depression and thought of nothing but her calls, although Wallis was concerned about his increasing insistence on abdication, issuing a statement from Cannes in which she said that she was anxious to avoid damaging His Majesty or the throne. Indeed, Wallis's letters to friends indicate further that she was terrified of playing a part in a constitutional crisis in which the king would have to resign. The king's lawyer, Theodore Goddard, met with Wallis in France and recorded privately that she was definitely prepared to leave the king in order to avoid a crisis, although he was not prepared to give her up and was willing to abdicate in order to marry her. Wallis formally declared this willingness to Goddard and made it clear that her greatest desire was to leave the situation in which she found herself. On the 10th of December 1936, fewer than 6 weeks after Wallis had divorced Ernest, the king signed the instrument of abdication at Fort Belvedere alongside his 3 brothers. Once this had been approved by Parliament, he would formally be regarded as a private citizen, and gave a speech broadcast from Windsor Castle in which he expressed love for Wallis and his loyalty to the new king, his brother George. Winston Churchill compared the situation to that which had faced Charles I, an analogy echoed by Virginia Woolf. This concluded Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, left England aboard the HMS Fury. He was the first monarch since James II and the Anglo-Saxon kings Ine and Ceolwulf to cede the throne, and had done so, as far as can be ascertained, owing to his love for Wallis. Wallis herself believed that she had been used by politicians as a way of removing a lazy and unstable monarch from power. This view was shared by many other politicians of the day, with David Lloyd George writing of his anger that Baldwin had managed to remove the monarch by actively calling attention to facts which made the king's position untenable. Wallis realized that she had become entangled in a position from which she had no hope of escape, and subsequently that she had become an exile. She was highly conscious of Edward's mental state, which made her feel ever more responsible and isolated. In a December letter to Ernest, she wrote, "None of this mess is of my own making. I miss you and worry about you. I shan't live very long and am in fact a prisoner. Oh dear, wasn't life lovely, sweet and simple?" The assault on Edward and Wallis was renewed the day after the abdication, on which the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Lang, decried Edward for giving in to a craving for private happiness, and said in a speech broadcast on the BBC that it is sad that he should have sought his happiness in a manner inconsistent with the Christian principles of marriage. Lang was subject to intense criticism for his language, and many described him as a scold. Many other writers in publications such as the New Statesman described the event as a smashing clerical victory, although one which was unnecessary and invasive. There remained another pressure concerning how the former king was perceived, and Buckingham Palace was concerned that the Duke of Windsor, better looking, more adventurous and outgoing than the new king, would steal the limelight even after he had ceded the throne. Edward remained popular with some swathes of British society and received open support from the British Union of Fascists, the leader of which, Oswald Mosley, claimed that he was in direct communication with Edward and that he hoped to form a new government with the former king once again in office. Edward and Wallis were, by Christmas 1936, both in Europe, but remained apart. It had been decided that the two should not immediately be reunited, and so Wallis remained in France and Edward in Austria. Wallis wrote often to Ernest and expressed her boredom and frustration at the situation, as well as her great anger and upset at the publication of several biographies of her, which made several unfounded claims. She was also featured as a waxwork in Madame Tussauds, but was grouped away from the royals and instead with Marie Antoinette and Joan of Arc. In early March 1937, Wallis left Cannes and travelled with her servant Mary Burke to the Loire Valley in central France to stay with Charles Bedeau, a self-made entrepreneur who had written on labour management and operations efficiency. Bedeau would later be accused of collusion with the Nazis and committed suicide prior to his trial for treason. He was already in the 1930s under surveillance from the US and British security services. However, a subsequent French government investigation actually found that he had worked to protect Jewish property and sabotaged German production lines. Edward, meanwhile, was engaged in planning the wedding for which he had given up so much. There was great concern that if any members of the royal family attended, it would undermine their position even more than it had done already. Edward was angered at this and wrote to his brother asking if he could help him procure a dignified setting for his marriage to Wallis, to which the king replied, saying that he greatly wished to help, but this was not simply a private matter. The only royal chaplain willing to host the ceremony was the vicar of St. Paul's, Darlington, R.A. Jardine, a former street preacher who had, on occasion, claimed that he was a faith healer and who had agreed to perform the ceremony after he had undergone a religious experience in which he claimed to have heard a voice which commanded him to go to France and officiate the wedding. Others involved in the wedding preparations included the society florist Constance Spry, who had been a close contact and friend of Edward, and who had missed out on a great deal of exposure and income from the coronation, which Wallis hoped to make up for by engaging her for their wedding. Besides those who had been engaged, relatively few guests had accepted invitations to the wedding, in large part due to their concern as to how this would affect their reputations at home. The wedding day itself was set for the 3rd of June 1937 at the Château de Condé, the home of Charles Bedeau. Edward met Jardine that morning and shook his hand, saying, "Thank God you've come. Pardon my language, but you're the only one who had the guts to do this for me." The altar for the ceremony was initially an oak chest which had been dragged in from another room, although an alternative was obtained from a nearby church. For her 3rd wedding, Wallis wore a pale blue crepe dress with a halo-style hat. The colour of her outfit was to become known as Wallis Blue, and was designed to match her eyes, which she further accented with sapphires made by Van Cleef and Arpels. Edward's best man was Edward Fruity Metcalfe, his former equerry to the Duke of Windsor when he was king, and a close friend to Edward. On the wedding day, a letter from King George VI noted that after they had been married, Wallis would not be entitled to the honorific Her Royal Highness, which Edward bitterly described as a nice wedding present. Edward decided that he would, regardless, refer to Wallis as HRH, and ordered that his household do the same, an arrangement which often caused confusion. Baba Metcalfe, the wife of Fruity, noted that 7 English people were present at the wedding of a man who, 6 months ago, was the King of England. The entire wedding party consisted of Fruity and Baba, Herman and Catherine Rogers, who were friends of Wallis, Walter Monckton, Edward's legal adviser and friend, Charles and Fern Beddoe, their hosts at the castle, Aunt Bessie Merriman, Lady Selby, Dudley Forward, Edward's new equerry as the Duke of Windsor, and George Allen. Léon Blum, the French Prime Minister, sent a bouquet of flowers, but the British government had no official influence or presence at the wedding whatsoever. Jardine, who had officiated the ceremony, returned to a parish and a country which loathed him, and he was soon forced to move to America. Many of the other guests risked their reputations, and Lady Selby had travelled without her husband, as his concern over the matter was too great, and he decided not to attend as a result. So it was that Edward and Wallis were married. The Duke of Windsor had in many ways failed to acquire royal titles for his wife and to marry her at a dignified wedding ceremony. After the wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor went on their honeymoon, which took them to the Corinthian mountains and Venice, which had been bedecked by flowers by Mussolini's fascist government. They continued travelling throughout Europe for a number of months and finished up in Paris, staying at the Hôtel Meurice while searching for a home, settling first at a house in Versailles and then on the Boulevard Suchet. Their lives for this period were marked by isolation, as well as a relatively aimless existence in which they had failed to find a defined purpose and could thus never escape the fact that they had been exiled. In the light of this, the invitation from Charles Bedeau to visit Germany, in which he had substantial business interests, was appealing. Edward was a lover of Germany and was open about his support for her people and even her government. The Austro-Hungarian ambassador had reported that, in 1933, Edward had expressed his remarkable sympathies for the Nazis in Germany. He naturally condemns the Treaty of Versailles. "I hope that we shall never have to fight a war again, but if so, it will have to be on the winning side, and that will be the German." The chance of a visit to Germany also had the potential to offer Wallis the chance for a state visit, and the reception which would be afforded to someone of her title. Edward and Wallis arrived in Berlin in early October and were greeted by a number of Nazi leaders at Friedrichstrasse station. They later met with Goebbels, Ribbentrop, Himmler and Hess. During their stay, they toured mines, youth camps and housing projects, the Duke relishing the chance to speak German and showing signs of evident enjoyment at the reception he had received in comparison to that which he had left behind. The most notable moment of the trip occurred when the Duke and Duchess met with Adolf Hitler in his mountaintop retreat, the Berghof. The visit came 3 days after Lord Halifax had expressed the desire to learn more about Hitler's expansionist aims, and it furthered Hitler's belief that if he gained control of England, he could install the Duke and Duchess as a sympathetic party in power. To many, the image of Edward and Wallis beaming before Hitler and his uniformed guards was definitive of both. During this period, the relationship between Edward and his family entirely collapsed. He was well aware that his brother, his sister-in-law the Queen, and his mother were staunchly opposed to him returning in any capacity, whether for a prolonged period or even a brief stay. One letter, penned by the Duke to his mother, made his response incredibly clear. "You and Bertie, by his ignominious capitulation to the wiles of his ambitious wife, have made further normal correspondence between us impossible." Churchill remained loyal to the former king and argued in favour of Edward and Wallis throughout the various meetings and political dramas which involved them. He also made a point to visit them in their new villa in Cap d'Antibes, which overlooked the Mediterranean. In the study was the desk that Edward had used to sign the instrument of abdication, which remained a permanent feature in any home that the couple lived in. Despite their surroundings, it was clear that the couple continued to feel that they were living in exile, and both of them expressed a desire to return to England. By 1939, this appeared more like a possibility, with one poll suggesting that 61% of the public desired the return of the Windsors, with 16% opposed. By August 1939, the prospect of conflict with Germany appeared acute, and the Duke and Duchess made plans to evacuate from France. Edward telegrammed Hitler at the end of the month and implored him to seek peace. Hitler replied simply that his attitude towards England remains the same. The next day, the two nations were at war with one another. At the beginning of September, plans were made to fly the Duke and Duchess out of France, although Edward complained that the aircraft proposed was too small and that he wanted all of his luggage to be returned with him. Metcalfe, his equerry, replied that they had behaved as two spoiled children. "Women and children are being bombed while you talk of your pride." Eventually, Churchill sent a destroyer, HMS Kelly, under the command of Lord Louis Mountbatten. Churchill had arranged for a grand reception for them once they had arrived at Portsmouth, with soldiers standing guard to receive the Windsors once the ship had docked. The couple stayed for a few days at Metcalfe's London flat before returning to France, where the Duke had been posted to the British military mission, and Wallis left to join a French relief organisation, which she did as a member of the French Red Cross, delivering plasma, bandages and medical instruments to positions behind the Maginot Line. Once the Germans had breached the Maginot Line, the Duke and Duchess were once again advised to flee France, and they travelled to Spain in May 1940, where they stayed at the expense of the government, a fascist regime under General Franco, despite the fact that he had become Prime Minister of a state on the brink of an invasion. Churchill wrote to ensure that the Spanish put up the Windsors in the greatest possible comfort, which they did. giving them 2 rooms at the Ritz in Madrid. All the while, the Duke wrote home demanding that if he and Wallis returned, they should be received at Buckingham Palace and receive tax reimbursements from the civil list, despite their considerable wealth. An exacting demand at the best of times, but downright poor form in the midst of such hardship within the wider public. Churchill, upon learning of Edward's desertion from duty in Paris, reprimanded him, and he was soon declared the new governor of the Bahamas. A collection of 29 islands with a population of 70,000 were regarded at the time as the most backward-looking of the colonies. The islands suffered from high unemployment and a dependence on American tourists, and was commonly regarded as a punishment station for officials who had to be occupied and kept out of the way. The Duke and Duchess were dispatched to the islands and moved into the government house in Nassau, which was in a state of disrepair and was indeed semi-derelict. Wallis and Edward disliked the hot weather, but agreed that it was good for the figure. Certainly, neither openly complained about the situation, and Wallis engaged herself in work for the Red Cross, of which she was the local president. Visitors commented that she seemed genuinely concerned and friendly towards those she helped. In private, however, the couple were greatly concerned about their possessions, many of which they had left at home, and Edward contemplated a leave of absence from his position. However, this was met with outrage, and Churchill reprimanded the Duke for his idea, given that the people of Britain are suffering so much. Wallis reported in letters to Monckton that it was unfair for Edward to be governor of such a small place, given that he had formerly been the King of England, and expressed again her belief that the government was persecuting them. Wallis lamented in her personal notes her new station, which she compared with Napoleon's exile to Elba, describing the islands as a dump, and stating bluntly that we both hate it. The couple made several visits to the US against the wishes of the British government, and enjoyed somewhat greater popularity in the American press as a result, and were received by large and jubilant crowds in Washington, New York, and Baltimore. Mary Kirk, now Ernest's wife and the former best friend of Wallis, had developed cancer in 1940, and, knowing that she did not have long to live, expressed a desire to see her child, who had been evacuated to North America. Churchill remembered the willingness of Ernest during the divorce process and managed to arrange a government plane to fly the couple to the US. After Mary had died, Wallis wrote to Ernest and offered her services to him in whatever way she could be of help. Meanwhile, life in the Bahamas dramatically changed after the Japanese attack on the US naval base of Pearl Harbor, with a significant number of troops and airmen now stationed on the islands from Coastal Command. Wallis spent a great deal of time working to fix up an RAF mess and attended her Red Cross duties early each morning, her work having taken on a greater level of urgency, establishing a new household rule that no parties would be attended by the couple unless they were for charity. Wallis also founded a clinic for women and young children, which involved a considerable amount of personal time and investment, and dedicated herself to working for the airmen stationed in the region, many of whom later recalled the fact that they were served their breakfast by the Duchess of Windsor. This was work that she evidently seemed to enjoy, and which gave her a sense of purpose and duty, which she relished. Indeed, this excitement and sense of purpose made her position in the Bahamas all the harder to bear, since she felt that she had been isolated from the war and was keen to do more to help in the combined effort. This mood worsened when the couple heard that Prince George, Edward's younger brother, had been killed in a plane crash along with his wife in August 1942. The couple had always been caring and understanding towards Wallis and Edward, and their death had left a bitter sting. The couple remained isolated and were upset that they had routinely been so well received in America but snubbed in Canada and the UK. Whilst both remained eager to leave the Bahamas, they were concerned that if they returned to England, they would once again be ostracised. This situation worsened in March 1941 when Edward gave an interview to the American Liberty magazine, in which he expressed again the view that some sort of negotiated peace should be arranged between the Allies and Germany. This infuriated Churchill, who had maintained that an outright victory was possible and should be regarded as the goal. Towards the end of the war, there was a slackening in the government's hold over the couple, and Churchill began inquiring as to whether there were any jobs in the British Embassy in Washington which could engage the Duke, a plan which was shot down by Ernest Bevin, the Foreign Secretary. Nonetheless, the couple left the Bahamas on the 3rd of May 1945 and went to the US without any defined plan of where they should live or what they should do. Edward and Wallis remained in limbo for the following 6 years, and remained, in the words of Wallis, homeless on the face of the earth. They rented and stayed in homes for the duration of this period, deciding that it would be untenable for them to return to England, with Wallis instead entertaining the idea that they could return to France, where she would be able to create a home for the Duke which could give him some stability. The couple did return to England in 1946, but the trip had been a disaster. Wallis had £25,000 worth of jewellery stolen during the night of the 16th of October, an event which turned the attention of the British press on them once again, ruining any hopes they had entertained of a quiet trip. The aftermath of this was not only the loss of many of her jewels, but the resurgence of an admonition in the press for the excess and vanity of the couple, particularly Wallis. By 1952, the couple had decided they should move to France, settling in a home in Gif-sur-Yvette, south of Versailles and just outside of Paris. They also had a rented home in the centre of the city, on which they spent a fortune renovating. In February 1952, news reached the couple that the King, George VI, had died of lung cancer. The Duke went along to attend his brother's funeral, and the subsequent accession of Elizabeth II did little to alter the relationship between Edward, Wallis, and the royal family. Wallis and Edward generated an income for themselves, largely through writing. Edward first for Life magazine, and then through a memoir called A King's Story, and Wallis through her memoir, The Heart Has Its Reasons. Both works were well received, and Wallis's writing was regarded as open and honest, which won her friends in the literary world, such as Maxine Sandberg. Opinions on Wallis varied massively between those who met her during this period. The daughter of Fruity Metcalfe remarked that Wallis was an incredibly kind and loving person, whereas the publisher of her book, Charles Pick, stated that she was a rather brittle, hard and vain person. When Queen Mary, Edward's mother, died in March 1953, Edward once again travelled along to England in order to attend her funeral, and wrote back to Wallis expressing his sadness that her rejection of him and his wife had remained with her until the very end, penning, "My sadness is mixed with incredulity that any mother could have been so hard and cruel toward her eldest son for so many years. I'm afraid the fluids in her veins have always been as icy cold as they are now in death." The life that the Duke and Duchess fell into was one of boredom and repetition. They attended dinners, went shopping, occasionally appeared at charity events. Both became obsessed with their weight and eventually ate as little as a single piece of fruit for lunch, nothing besides black tea and juice for breakfast and tiny portions of meat for dinner, which would often be left untouched. Many others commented that Wallis and Edward had grown more bitter in exile, with one diplomat recalling that, upon dropping her handbag, Wallis hadn't thanked him when he stopped to pick it up, instead commenting, "I like to see the British grovelling to me." Many more commented on the dynamic of the relationship that the Duke and Duchess had with one another, that whilst she treated him often with condescension and irritability, he remained devoted and obsessed with her, his eyes following his wife around a room and becoming deeply sad when she was not present. The Duke of Windsor died on the 28th of May 1972, after experiencing a brief but painful battle with throat cancer. Queen Elizabeth II had mandated that both he and Wallis could be buried together in the royal grounds at Frogmore, and Wallis travelled to England for the funeral, during which time she was permitted to stay at Buckingham Palace, where she remarked that even now the attitude of the royals remained cold towards her. Wallis returned to Paris alone and travelled to England only once more, to lay flowers at Edward's grave and to have tea with the Queen at Windsor. Her life in France was lonely, and one of her only points of solace was a letter written to her by Charles, the then Prince of Wales, who spoke of his admiration for his uncle, which, for a time, allowed her to entertain the thought that relations between her and the family might improve. The Duchess soon experienced a decline in her health, which led her to act as if the Duke was still alive, talking to him and even imploring him not to abdicate. By 1975, she had suffered a significant deterioration and spent much of her time travelling to and from the hospital. She died on the 24th of April 1986 in Paris. Her funeral service was held in St. George's Chapel at Windsor and was attended by around 200 people. It was remarked that many of the flowers which adorned her coffin were sent not by friends, but by Van Cleef and Dior, the fashion and jewellery houses which she had patronised for so much of her life, and she was laid to rest alongside the Duke of Windsor. Wallis Simpson is remembered as an ambitious woman who was driven to advance her own standing and interests, which she managed to achieve, albeit often at the expense of other people, such as Mary Kirk and Ernest Simpson. Wallis was undoubtedly an adventurous and brave person. The periods in her life when she was alone saw her travel to new and sometimes dangerous places, eager to have new experiences and meet new people. She loved the social scene and was fearless in her self-expression, even when this met with the disapproval of royals and social elites. Her life was also marked with a high degree of strife. Her difficult childhood and financial subjugation to her uncle was followed by an abusive and controlling first marriage, soon followed by a second which, whilst stable, left her lonely and bored. Her relationship with Edward was one in which she often felt trapped and powerless, as demonstrated by her numerous recorded wishes to leave. Her third marriage lost her many of her friends, and she was left to lead a life marked by isolation and exile, with a man who was obsessive over her. Wallis was socially tone-deaf at times in her life, and her love of finery was often at odds with the political and social situation. This was suggestive of a person who was out of touch with the experiences of a population battered by war and financial difficulty. She was also, however, a dedicated servant, and threw a great deal of time and effort into her work with the Red Cross, and as an official in the Bahamas, for which she was kindly remembered by many service people. What do you think of Wallis Simpson? Was she portrayed unfairly during her lifetime? Or should she be remembered as a cunning and ambitious social climber with limitless ambition? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.